They were told they didn't belong in uniform, that they lacked the courage, the discipline, the very backbone needed to face the German war machine. Yet in the blood-soaked trenches of France, they would fight longer and harder than any other American regiment in the Great War. The German soldiers thought it was absurd. Reports filtered through their lines that the Americans were deploying black infantry to the Western Front. Men they considered primitive, untrained, incapable of withstanding the hammer blows of the Kaiser's finest divisions. In German officer quarters, some chuckled over their morning coffee, as if the mere thought of facing such opponents was laughable. They predicted easy victories, quick routes, but those same officers would soon encounter a regiment that carried themselves with steel in their spines and fire in their hearts. And by November 1918, the forests of France would echo with a very different story. Imagine yourself in early 1917. The Great War had been devouring Europe for nearly 3 years. The Western Front stretched like a festering wound from Belgium to Switzerland, a maze of muddy trenches, rotting sandbags, and rusted barbed wire. Millions had already died for gains measured in yards. France was bleeding out, its cities draped in black as families mourned sons who would never return. Britain's army was exhausted, ground down by the meat grinder of Somme, Verdun, Passchendaele. Each offensive promised breakthrough. Each delivered only carnage. The Allies needed help desperately. Then, America entered the war in April 1917. Fresh soldiers, untapped resources, industrial might. To the French and British, it was a lifeline. But for Black Americans who rushed to enlist, eager to prove their patriotism, the response from their own country was cold rejection. The United States military in 1917 was rigidly segregated. Jim Crow didn't stop at the recruitment office door. It followed black volunteers into training camps, into mess halls, into every corner of military life. The prevailing belief among white officers was simple and ugly. Black men were naturally cowardly, intellectually inferior, unsuited for the demands of modern warfare. These weren't whispered opinions. They were stated openly in reports, repeated in briefings, enshrined in policy. When black men volunteered, most were shunted into labor battalions. The services of supply, they called it, a polite name for backbreaking work far from any glory. These men dug latrines, hauled ammunition crates, loaded ships at French ports. They built roads, strung telephone wire, buried the dead. The message was unmistakable. Your country needs your sweat, not your valor. Your hands, not your courage. But in New York City, in the vibrant heart of Harlem, something extraordinary was taking form. Picture Harlem in 1916, alive with possibility. Jazz rhythms spilled from basement speakeasies. On street corners, men debated Marcus Garvey's speeches and the future of their people. Poets scribbled in notebooks. Families gathered in brownstones. Children playing stickball in the streets. It was a place where Black Americans had carved out space to breathe, to create, to dream. When war came and the call went out for soldiers, Harlem answered. Men lined up outside recruitment offices, ready to serve. They came from everywhere. Musicians who could make a clarinet sing, porters who had worked the railroads, college men with engineering degrees, laborers with calloused hands. Some had never touched a weapon. Others had hunted since boyhood. What bound them together was a fierce determination to prove something, not just to white America, but to themselves. They enlisted in what would become the 369th Infantry Regiment, part of the New York National Guard. On paper, it was another segregated unit, expected to fade into obscurity like so many others. But these men refused to accept that fate. They drilled in armories, marching in formation until their feet bled. They practiced rifle drills until their shoulders ached. They studied tactics, maps, military history. One recruit later remembered the intensity. We knew we were carrying more than our own futures. Every step we took, every order we followed, we were answering for all of us. The weight was enormous. If they failed, it would be used as proof that black soldiers couldn't fight. If they succeeded, they might crack open a door that had been bolted shut for generations. Their commander was Colonel William Hayward, a white attorney from Nebraska who had been a political ally of Theodore Roosevelt. Hayward was an unusual man for his time. He genuinely believed his troops could be as good as any in the Army. He fought the military bureaucracy to get them proper rifles, uniforms, training time. He petitioned, argued, and demanded that his regiment be given a real chance. But even Hayward's determination couldn't overcome the institutional racism baked into the American Expeditionary Forces. The prejudice wasn't subtle. It was a brick wall. When the 369th prepared to ship overseas in December 1917, white regiments received priority for everything: new equipment, experienced trainers, transportation. The 369th got hand-me-downs and skepticism. Some white officers requested transfers rather than serve alongside black soldiers. The men heard the whispers, saw the sneers. They knew what people thought of them. The crossing to France was long and tense. Packed into transport ships, the men of the 369th sailed through submarine-infested waters. They played cards, wrote letters home, and wondered what awaited them on the other side of the Atlantic. Some spoke quietly about their hopes. Maybe France would be different. Maybe there they could prove themselves. Others were more guarded, having learned not to expect much from a world that had given them so little. When they finally disembarked at the port of Brest in January 1918, the French winter cut through their uniforms. The landscape was gray, the towns battered by years of war, and almost immediately, the 369th was assigned to labor duties. They were handed shovels and pickaxes, not rifles. They unloaded supply ships, built railroad tracks, repaired roads torn apart by artillery. Day after day, they watched white American units march toward the front lines while they stayed behind, doing the work no one else wanted. The frustration was crushing. These men had trained to fight. They had volunteered to defend their country. Instead, they were treated as a labor pool, invisible except when there was heavy lifting to be done. At night, in cold barracks, they asked each other the same question: would they ever get their chance? But unbeknownst to them, the French army was watching, and the French had a very different view of what these soldiers might accomplish. The stage was set for a transformation that would shock both allies and enemies. A regiment dismissed by their own country was about to be given the opportunity they'd been denied. And when that moment came, the Harlem Hellfighters would seize it with both hands and never let go. Before the 369th could prove themselves in battle, they first had to escape the shadow of American prejudice. That escape came from an unexpected source: the French army, desperate for reinforcements and willing to see soldiers as soldiers, regardless of skin color. By the spring of 1918, the situation on the Western Front had reached a critical point. Germany had knocked Russia out of the war and was transferring hundreds of thousands of troops from the Eastern Front to France. The German High Command knew this was their last chance to win before American forces arrived in full strength. In March, they launched Operation Michael, a massive offensive that smashed through British lines and threatened to split the Allied armies in two. The French were reeling. They had lost over 1 million men in 4 years of fighting. Entire villages in France had no young men left. The army was exhausted, stretched impossibly thin. French commanders pleaded with the Americans for troops, any troops that could hold a section of the line. But General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, refused to parcel out his units. He insisted on keeping American soldiers under American command, building up forces for a grand offensive under his control. There was one exception he was willing to make: the black regiments. Pershing saw an opportunity to rid himself of units he didn't want while helping the French. He offered to loan several black regiments to the French army for the duration of the war. The French accepted without hesitation. They needed bodies in the trenches, and they had no patience for American racial theories. For the men of the 369th, the transfer came as shocking news. They were told to turn in their American equipment and uniforms. They would be re-equipped with French weapons, French helmets, French everything. They would eat French rations, follow French orders, and fight as part of the French army. Some felt abandoned, cast off by their own country. One soldier later wrote, They didn't want us to fight under the American flag. They made that clear, so they gave us to the French like we were equipment they didn't need. But others saw it differently. This was their chance. The French were actually going to put them on the front lines. After months of labor duty, they would finally get to fight. The 369th was assigned to the French 16th Division. When they arrived at the French sector, the contrast was immediate and startling. French officers greeted them without condescension. There were no segregated facilities, no separate entrances, no constant reminders that they were considered inferior. French soldiers shared meals with them, bunked alongside them, treated them as comrades. For men who had grown up under Jim Crow, who had been rejected by their own military, this treatment was almost surreal. One Harlem soldier recalled his first dinner with French troops. They passed us wine, broke bread with us, joked with us. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for them to tell us to eat somewhere else. It never happened. This isn't to say France was a racial paradise. French colonial troops from Africa and Indochina faced their own discrimination, but in the context of frontline service, the French military operated with a pragmatism born of desperation. If you could shoot straight and hold a trench, you were valuable. The French did more than just accept the 369th. They trained them. French officers taught them how to use the Liebel rifle, the Chauchat light machine gun, and French grenades. They drilled them in French infantry tactics, which emphasized aggressive patrolling and hand-to-hand combat. The training was intense, professional, and devoid of the hostility they'd faced from American instructors. Within weeks, the men of the 369 were learning to navigate trench systems, practicing bayonet charges, and studying German positions on detailed maps. They absorbed everything, hungry to prove themselves. But the real education came when they entered the trenches for the first time. Nothing could prepare them for it. Imagine descending into that underground world. The trenches were deep cuts in the earth, walls shored up with sandbags and wooden planks. They zigzagged to prevent enemy fire from enfilading an entire section. The bottom was often covered in duckboards to keep men out of the mud, but in spring the mud was everywhere, a thick, sucking morass that clung to boots and could swallow a man if he stepped off the boards. The smell hit you first, a nauseating mix of human waste, rotting sandbags, stagnant water, and death. Bodies lay buried in the trench walls, sometimes a hand or boot protruding. No one spoke about it. You just learned not to look. Rats scurried everywhere, fat and fearless, feeding on the dead. At night, their squeaking filled the darkness. The men of the 369th stood sentry, peering over the parapet into no man's land. Out there, beyond the barbed wire, the German trenches mirrored their own. At night, flares shot up, bathing the landscape in harsh white light. Anyone caught moving froze, knowing German snipers watched for any flicker of motion. Artillery fire was constant. The sound became part of existence, a baseline rumble punctuated by ear-splitting crashes when shells landed close. The ground shook. Dirt rained down. Men learned to judge the whistle of incoming rounds, to know when to duck and when to pray. Gas attacks added another layer of terror. The first time the alarm sounded, men scrambled for their masks, hearts pounding. They'd been trained, but training couldn't capture the panic of seeing that yellow-green cloud rolling toward you, knowing that one breath without your mask meant choking, drowning in your own fluids. In those early days, the French officers watched the 369th closely, gauging their reactions. Would they crack under the pressure? Would they break and run when the shelling intensified? The answer came quickly. The Harlem soldiers held steady. They manned their posts, kept their sectors clean, rotated guard duty without complaint. When German patrols probed their lines at night, they responded with disciplined fire. French officers began reporting back. These Americans were solid. One French captain wrote in his diary, "The colored troops from New York show remarkable calm under fire. They do not panic. They obey orders. I would trust them to hold any section of the line." But the 369th wasn't content to just hold. They wanted to prove they could take the fight to the enemy. The French army encouraged aggressive patrolling, sending small groups into no man's land to raid German trenches, gather intelligence, and capture prisoners. The 369th volunteered for these missions eagerly. Picture a raid. It happened at night. Always. A small group of soldiers, faces blackened with mud, crawling on their bellies through the muck. They cut through barbed wire with practiced care, each snip sounding impossibly loud. The German trench was just ahead, voices carried on the wind. Then the rush. Up and over, grenades flying, rifles cracking, bayonets flashing in the dark. Chaos and violence compressed into seconds. Then, the scramble back, dragging a prisoner if they were lucky, carrying a wounded comrade if they weren't. These raids earned the 369th respect from their French counterparts and fear from the Germans. Word began spreading through enemy lines about the black American soldiers fighting with the French. German propaganda tried to exploit racial tensions, dropping leaflets encouraging black soldiers to desert, promising them better treatment. The leaflets went unanswered. The men of the 369th had no interest in German promises. They were here to fight. But their most significant contribution was yet to come. They hadn't been tested by a major German offensive, hadn't faced the full fury of the Kaiser's army. That test was approaching fast, and it would come in a forest that would become synonymous with their courage. Still, in those first months with the French, something fundamental shifted for the men of the 369. They were no longer an experiment waiting to fail. They were soldiers, plain and simple. The French saw it, the Germans feared it, and slowly word filtered back to American commanders that the Black Regiment fighting with the French was performing admirably. Some American officers dismissed the reports, convinced it was French exaggeration. Others began to wonder if they'd been wrong. But for the men in the trenches, none of that mattered. They had been given a chance, and they were determined to make it count. Every patrol, every night watch, every German attack repulsed was another brick laid in the foundation of their legacy. The real test, however, was still to come. Before the name Hellfighters became legend, it had to be earned in blood, mud, and the kind of brutal close-quarters combat that broke lesser units. The crucible came in the spring and summer of 1918, when the 369th would face not just German soldiers, but the very limits of human endurance. The first significant engagement came in May 1918, in a quiet sector that wouldn't stay quiet for long. The 369th was holding a section of trenches in the Champagne region, east of Reims. It was supposed to be a holding action, a defensive posture while the Allies prepared for counteroffensives. But the Germans had other plans. They knew the French line was thin, stretched to breaking. They also knew that a Black American regiment was holding one portion. Some German officers saw this as a weakness to exploit. Late one night, the attack came without warning. No preparatory bombardment, just shadows pouring over the parapet. German stormtroopers, elite assault troops trained in infiltration tactics. They came with grenades, trench clubs, and savage efficiency. In the darkness, hand-to-hand fighting erupted. Imagine the chaos, the flash of muzzle fire in pitch black, men grappling in mud, bayonets finding flesh, the wet sounds of violence too close and too personal. German soldiers had been told these would be easy trenches to take. They discovered otherwise. The men of the 369th fought with a ferocity that shocked their attackers. They held the line, drove back the assault, and left German bodies tangled in the wire. When dawn broke, French officers surveyed the scene. The 369th hadn't just survived. They'd inflicted heavy casualties while taking relatively few themselves. Reports flew up the chain of command. The Black American Regiment had proven itself in close combat. But one action, no matter how successful, doesn't build a legend. That requires consistency, the kind that comes from doing the impossible again and again until it becomes expected. The 369th began rotating into some of the most contested sectors of the front, places where German artillery pounded relentlessly, where snipers picked off anyone careless enough to show themselves, where gas attacks came with sickening regularity. Through it all, the regiment held. They didn't break, they didn't crack. Men died, of course. Artillery claimed some, snipers others. Disease killed men in the trenches just as surely as bullets, dysentery and trench foot and pneumonia. Each loss was felt deeply. At night, soldiers wrote letters home, struggling to describe what they were living through. One private wrote to his mother, "I can't tell you where we are or what we've seen, but I can tell you this. We're showing them. Every day, we're showing them what we're made of." That determination, that refusal to give their critics any ammunition, became the regiment's defining characteristic. But the most famous moment of those early months came not from a large battle, but from two men alone in the dark. It was May 15th, 1918. Privates Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts were manning an observation post in a forward position, isolated from the main trench line. Their job was to watch for German patrols and raise the alarm. The night was still, almost peaceful. Then came the sound of wire cutters. The two men peered into the darkness and saw shadows moving. Germans, at least a dozen, cutting through the wire. Johnson and Roberts opened fire, but their position was about to be overrun. The Germans rushed them, grenades exploding, rifle fire ripping through the night. Roberts was hit almost immediately, badly wounded. Johnson kept firing until his rifle jammed. Then he fought with the only thing he had left, a bolo knife. What happened next became the stuff of legend. Johnson, a former railroad porter from Albany, who stood barely 5'4", fought off German soldiers with his knife in brutal hand-to-hand combat. He slashed, stabbed, and when they tried to drag Roberts away as a prisoner, Johnson launched himself at them with such fury that the Germans fell back. By the time French reinforcements arrived, Johnson had killed 4 Germans and wounded at least 10 more. He himself had been shot multiple times and suffered over 20 wounds from bullets, grenades, and bayonets. Roberts, despite his injuries, had thrown grenades until he couldn't lift his arms. The French were astonished. 2 men had held off a German raiding party and won. News of the action spread like wildfire. The French awarded Johnson and Roberts the Croix de Guerre, France's highest military honor. They were the first Americans of any race to receive it in World War I. But more importantly, the story reached the American press. Here was something undeniable. 2 black soldiers, outnumbered and wounded, had fought with extraordinary courage. For the folks back home, especially in Harlem, it was vindication. The white newspapers that had ignored or downplayed black military service now had to acknowledge it. Henry Johnson became a hero, his face printed in papers across America. When he eventually returned to the United States, he was greeted with parades. But the war wasn't done with the 369th, not by a long measure. As summer approached, the German spring offensive was running out of steam. The massive attacks that had threatened Paris were being blunted by Allied resistance and American reinforcements. But the Germans still held huge swathes of French territory, and driving them out would require brutal offensive operations. The 369th would be in the thick of it. They were assigned to participate in the Champagne-Marne offensive, a push to reclaim ground lost earlier in the year. This meant leaving the relative safety of defensive positions and advancing across open ground into German machine gun fire. It meant artillery barrages that turned forests into moonscapes. It meant casualties on a scale the regiment hadn't yet experienced. The offensive began in mid-July. The 369th went over the top with French units on either side. Picture the moment. Officers blowing whistles, men climbing ladders out of trenches, emerging into a landscape of smoke and noise. German machine guns opened up immediately, their characteristic ripsaw sound tearing through the air. Men fell, but the line kept moving forward. They advanced in short rushes, diving for cover behind shell craters, then up and forward again. The ground was torn apart, littered with the detritus of previous battles, broken rifles, shattered equipment, bodies. The regiment fought through German positions with grenades and bayonets. They cleared bunkers, took prisoners, and kept pressing forward even as casualties mounted. What distinguished the 369th was their aggressiveness. French commanders noted that when the attack bogged down, when other units hesitated under heavy fire, the Harlem soldiers kept moving. They didn't wait for orders. They saw an objective and took it. This wasn't recklessness, it was initiative. The kind of battlefield decision-making that separates good units from great ones. Over the course of the offensive, the 369th captured German positions, artillery pieces, and hundreds of prisoners. They suffered losses, yes. Men they'd trained with, eaten with, fought beside, didn't come back. Each empty spot in the ranks was a wound, but the regiment's reputation grew with every action. French newspapers began writing about les hommes de bronze, the men of bronze. The nickname stuck. But there was another name brewing, darker and more fitting. In German headquarters, officers pored over after-action reports. Their soldiers were describing encounters with black American troops that didn't fit the racial stereotypes. These weren't frightened, disorganized opponents. These were disciplined, aggressive fighters who seemed to lack the fear that exhaustion usually brought. German soldiers started calling them something else. Höllenkämpfer, Hellfighters. The name made its way across no man's land. When the 369th heard it, they adopted it with fierce pride. Let the Germans call them Hellfighters. Let them know fear when they saw these soldiers coming. The Harlem Hellfighters weren't just fighting for military objectives. They were fighting for respect, for recognition, for the right to be seen as equals. Back at their camps between actions, the men dealt with the psychological weight of combat. Some wrote home, carefully censoring their words so families wouldn't worry. Others played music, jazz and blues, drifting through the French countryside, a sound entirely foreign to this landscape, but somehow fitting. The regiment's band, led by James Reese Europe, became famous in its own right, performing for French civilians and spreading American music across Europe. But beneath the music, the exhaustion ran deep. Men slept when they could, often waking with a start at sounds that resembled incoming shells. They ate, cleaned their weapons, wrote letters, and tried not to think about the next time they'd go into the line. The summer of 1918 was brutal. The weather turned hot, making the trenches even more miserable. Flies swarmed, the stench intensified, but the 369th kept fighting. They participated in the Aisne-Marne offensive, helping to push the Germans back toward the Belgian border. Each battle added to their record. Each action proved again that they belonged on the battlefield. Yet, with all their success, they remained apart from the American army. While white American units trained, fought, and rested under American command, the 369 stayed with the French. Some men wondered if they'd been forgotten by their own country. Others were glad to be where they were valued. But the biggest test was still ahead. The final great offensive of the war was being planned, a push that would drive into the heavily fortified German positions in the Argonne forest. It would be the largest American operation of the war, and the 369th would be right in the middle of it. Everything they had endured, every fight they'd survived, had been preparation for this. The Meuse-Argonne offensive would become the bloodiest battle in American history, and the Harlem Hellfighters would write their names in its most brutal chapters. Before they could become legends, they had to survive the forest. The Argonne was where reputations went to die, where entire divisions vanished into the trees and emerged broken, if they emerged at all. For the 369th, it would be the test that proved everything. By September 1918, the tide of war had shifted decisively. The German spring offensive had failed. American forces were pouring into France by the hundreds of thousands. The Allies were finally strong enough to launch coordinated offensives all along the Western Front. The goal was ambitious: break through German lines before winter, force a decision, end the war. The Americans would carry the weight of the main effort in the Meuse-Argonne region, a heavily defended section of the front where the Germans had built layer upon layer of fortifications. The Argonne forest itself was a nightmare of terrain. Dense woods, ravines, underbrush so thick you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. The Germans had spent years fortifying it, transforming natural defenses into killing zones. Machine gun nests were cunningly placed to create overlapping fields of fire. Artillery was pre-registered on every approach. Barbed wire stretched in thick belts. And throughout the forest, concrete bunkers housed German troops who could rain fire on anyone trying to advance. The French had tried to push through the Argonne before and been bled white. Now it was America's turn, and the 369th would be part of the assault. The orders came in late September. The regiment would attack as part of the French Fourth Army on the left flank of the overall offensive. Their objective was to push through German lines, capture key positions, and keep pressing forward no matter the cost. The men knew what this meant. The Argonne's reputation preceded it. This wouldn't be a quick fight. It would be weeks of grinding, brutal combat in some of the worst terrain imaginable. On the morning of September 26th, the offensive began with the largest artillery barrage the Americans had ever fired. For hours, shells screamed overhead, pounding German positions. The noise was beyond description, a physical force that made the ground shake and the air vibrate. At 0 hour, whistles blew, and all along the front, men climbed out of their trenches and began advancing. The 369th went forward with French colonial troops on their flanks. Almost immediately, the plan began to fall apart. The artillery had failed to cut the wire. German machine guns had survived the bombardment, their crews emerging from deep bunkers to man their weapons. As the waves of infantry crossed no man's land, they walked into a storm of fire. Men fell by the dozens. The advance slowed, then stopped, then surged forward again as officers rallied their troops. The 369th pushed into the forest itself, and there the fighting became personal and terrifying. You couldn't see the enemy until you were almost on top of them. German soldiers appeared from behind trees, from concealed positions, firing at point-blank range. Every tree could hide a sniper. Every ravine could conceal a machine gun nest. Visibility was measured in feet, not yards. The regiment broke into smaller units, squads and platoons operating semi-independently, advancing when they could, taking cover when they had to. They used grenades to clear bunkers, bayonets for close combat. The fighting was exhausting, not just physically, but mentally. You couldn't let your guard down for a second. Every step could be your last. The sounds of battle echoed strangely in the forest, making it hard to tell where fire was coming from. Men communicated with hand signals, afraid to shout and give away positions. At night, the forest became even more treacherous. Patrols moved through the darkness, stumbling over roots, trying not to make noise. German patrols did the same. Sometimes they'd bump into each other in the dark, leading to brief, vicious firefights before both sides melted back into the trees. The 369th fought through these conditions for days, then weeks. They took casualties constantly. Snipers, machine guns, artillery, even hand-to-hand combat. Medics worked frantically, but there were never enough of them. Wounded men had to be carried back through the forest to aid stations, a process that could take hours and cost more lives. The regiment's commanders kept pushing them forward, demanding they take the next objective and the next. The men obeyed, not because they were unthinking, but because they understood what failure would mean. If they broke, if they retreated, it would be used as proof that black soldiers couldn't handle the pressure. Every yard gained was a victory not just against the Germans, but against prejudice itself. The French commanders were impressed, but also concerned. The 369th was being ground down. Replacements couldn't keep up with casualties. The men in the line were exhausted, running on adrenaline and willpower. But every time French officers suggested pulling them back for rest, the regiment's officers refused. Not yet. We can keep going. And they did. They fought through places that became seared into their memories. Sechaux, a village fortified by the Germans and turned into a strong point. The 369th attacked it repeatedly, finally taking it in brutal house-to-house fighting. Every room had to be cleared, every cellar checked. By the time it fell, the village was rubble and the regiment's ranks were thinner. Then there was Bellevue Ridge, a dominating piece of terrain the Germans were determined to hold. The 369th was ordered to take it. The attack began at dawn, men advancing up the slope under withering fire. They were cut down in waves, but those who survived kept climbing. They reached the German trenches and fought with grenades and entrenching tools and bare hands. The ridge changed hands twice before the Hellfighters secured it for good. The cost was staggering, but the objective was theirs. These weren't clean victories. There was nothing glorious about crawling through mud and blood, watching friends die, living in constant fear. But the 369th kept fighting because stopping wasn't an option. As October wore on, the offensive ground forward. The Germans were retreating, but slowly, contesting every meter. The 369th was constantly in contact with the enemy. Days blurred together. Wake up, check your weapon, eat if food was available, advance, fight, dig in, try to sleep while artillery thundered. Then, do it again. The mental strain was immense. Men started showing signs of shell shock, that 1,000-yard stare, flinching at sounds, hands trembling uncontrollably. But the regiment as a whole held together. They took care of each other. Veterans looked after new replacements. Officers stayed close to their men, sharing the same dangers, the same exhaustion. By early November, the 369th had been in continuous combat for over 40 days. No other American regiment could claim that record. They had advanced further than any other unit in their sector. They had captured German artillery, taken hundreds of prisoners, and seized every objective assigned to them. But the price had been paid in blood. The regiment that had entered the Argonne was not the same one that would emerge. They were harder, older in ways that had nothing to do with time. Some men barely spoke anymore, their eyes hollow. Others maintained a grim determination, counting down the days until it would be over. Through it all, they kept the line. They held when other units faltered. They advanced when the order came. And they earned a reputation that would outlive them all. Before the guns finally fell silent, before the celebrations and the parades, the 369th had to pay the butcher's bill. Glory in war always comes with a price tag written in blood and grief, and the Harlem Hellfighters paid in full. The fighting in the Argonne had taken a toll that statistics alone couldn't capture. Yes, the regiment had lost hundreds of men killed and wounded. Yes, entire companies had been reduced to skeleton crews. But the deeper cost was written on the faces of the survivors, in the letters they stopped writing home, in the way they flinched at sudden sounds even years later. Consider what it meant to fight for over 40 consecutive days. Most units were rotated out of the line after a week, given time to rest, refit, and recover. The 369th stayed in. Day after day, night after night, they manned the forward positions. Sleep came in snatches, always interrupted. Food was often cold rations eaten while huddled in a shell crater. There was no rear area safety, no place to truly relax. Even when pulled back a few hundred yards, German artillery could still reach them. The psychological strain of that constant exposure broke many men. Shell shock, they called it then. Today, we'd call it PTSD, trauma, combat stress. Whatever the name, the symptoms were real and devastating. Men who had been brave under fire suddenly couldn't function. They'd freeze at the sound of artillery, unable to move. Some developed violent tremors, their hands shaking so badly they couldn't hold a rifle. Others simply stared into space, unreachable, somewhere else entirely. The regiment's medical officers did what they could, but there was no real treatment, no understanding of what these men were going through. Some were sent to rear hospitals. Others stayed in the line because there was no one to replace them. The regiment needed every man it could get. One chaplain later wrote about walking the trenches at night, finding soldiers weeping silently, trying not to let their comrades see. I couldn't offer them much, he wrote. Prayer seemed hollow against what they'd experienced. All I could do was sit with them, let them know they weren't alone. The physical casualties were equally brutal. Men lost limbs to artillery, were blinded by gas, sustained wounds that would never fully heal. The regiment's casualty rate was among the highest of any American unit. Medics and stretcher bearers performed acts of heroism that went largely unrecognized, running into fire to drag wounded men back, working under bombardment to stabilize the dying. Many of them became casualties themselves. The aid stations were overwhelmed, blood-soaked tents where surgeons worked by lantern light, amputating shattered limbs, trying to stop bleeding, making impossible decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. The smell of those places, disinfectant, and blood and gangrene haunted everyone who entered. Back home, families received telegrams. The War Department regrets to inform you. In Harlem, gold stars appeared in windows, each one marking a son who wouldn't return. Churches held memorial services for men whose bodies lay in French soil, buried in hasty graves near where they fell. Mothers mourned. Fathers tried to stay strong. Wives became widows. Children grew up without fathers. The cost rippled outward, touching entire communities. But the families back home didn't know the worst of it, couldn't know. The letters that made it through were heavily censored. The soldiers themselves self-censored, not wanting to burden their loved ones with the truth of what they endured. As the Argonne offensive continued into November, rumors began spreading through the trenches that the Germans were seeking an armistice. Peace might be coming. But no one dared believe it. They'd been fighting for so long that peace seemed like a fantasy, something from another life. The 369th kept pushing forward, kept taking objectives, kept fighting as if the war would never end. On November 10th, the regiment was still in heavy contact with German forces. They captured the town of Seychaux after fierce fighting, clearing it house by house. That night, exhausted men dug in, expecting another dawn assault. Instead, at 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the guns stopped. The silence was shocking, almost painful. Men who had lived with the constant thunder of artillery for months suddenly heard nothing. Birds sang. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. Soldiers climbed out of their trenches cautiously, unable to believe it was real. Some cheered, others wept. Many just sat in stunned silence, trying to process that they had survived. The war was over. They had made it. But the celebration was muted for the 369th. They looked around at their depleted ranks, at the faces of men who had been boys when they enlisted, now aged beyond their years. They thought of the friends who weren't there to see this moment. The victory felt incomplete, purchased at too high a price. In the days following the armistice, the regiment began the process of accounting for their casualties, collecting personal effects of the dead to send home, writing letters to families. The numbers were sobering. The 369th had suffered more casualties than most American regiments. They had spent 191 days in combat, far longer than any other U.S. unit. They had never lost a foot of ground to the enemy, never had a man captured. But they had paid for that record with blood. French commanders praised them effusively. The entire regiment was awarded the Croix de Guerre by the French government. Over 170 individual members received French military honors. American recognition was slower in coming, grudging when it arrived. The physical healing would take time. The psychological healing for many would never come. Men returned to civilian life, carrying wounds no one could see, nightmares that lasted decades. Some found ways to cope, to build lives, to move forward. Others struggled, self-medicated with alcohol, couldn't hold jobs, became ghosts of who they'd been. The cost of their valor extended far beyond the battlefield. But even in the immediate aftermath, as they prepared to leave France, the men of the 369 knew they had accomplished something profound. They had fought as hard as any regiment in the American Expeditionary Forces. They had earned the respect of the French, the fear of the Germans, and grudging acknowledgement from their own army. They had proven that courage had no color. Part 6. The Return Home, 45 minutes to 54 minutes. Before they could be welcomed as heroes, they had to cross an ocean and face the country that had tried so hard to keep them from fighting at all. The return to America would prove that winning a war abroad didn't mean winning the peace at home. In December 1918, the 369th began the long journey back to the United States. They boarded transport ships at French ports, leaving behind the trenches and the graveyards, carrying with them memories and wounds that would never fully heal. The crossing was different from the voyage over. Then, they had been uncertain, untested, wondering what awaited them. Now they were veterans, hardened by combat, decorated by France, and expecting to be treated as the heroes they'd proven themselves to be. The first hint that things wouldn't be so simple came before they even left France. While white American regiments were being processed for return, receiving new uniforms and equipment, the 369th waited. They were still technically part of the French army, administratively separate from the rest of the American expeditionary forces. The bureaucracy that had shunted them aside before the war now delayed their return home. Some men wondered if they were being deliberately kept in France until after the white units had their parades. Finally, in February 1919, after months of waiting, they received orders. They would return to New York. The voyage was long and cold. Men stood on the decks as the ship approached New York Harbor, watching the Statue of Liberty emerge from the mist. Some wept at the sight. They had survived. They were home. On February 17, 1919, the 369th Infantry Regiment marched through the streets of Manhattan in what would become one of the most significant parades in American history. The city had been planning for it, and Harlem especially had been waiting for its sons to return. The streets were packed with people, thousands upon thousands lining the route. The regiment marched in their French helmets, carrying their French rifles, their chests covered with French medals. They marched with pride, back straight despite exhaustion, eyes forward. The regimental band, led by Lieutenant James Reese Europe, played jazz and martial music, a sound that had never been heard at an American military parade before. As they marched up Fifth Avenue toward Harlem, something extraordinary happened. The white crowds that had come to watch fell silent at first, unsure how to react to black soldiers being treated as heroes. But as the regiment passed, as people saw the medals, saw the bearing of these men, the applause began. It started scattered, then grew louder. By the time the 369th reached Harlem, the streets erupted. People wept, screamed, reached out to touch the soldiers. Mothers saw their sons. Widows honored their dead. Children waved flags. The entire neighborhood turned out in a celebration that lasted for hours. One soldier later recalled, "We'd fought in France, been honored by the French, but that day in Harlem, that was when it finally felt real. Our people knew what we'd done. They were proud of us." But the euphoria of that day couldn't erase the reality waiting beyond Harlem's borders. The men of the 369th were being discharged back into a society that still viewed them as second-class citizens. Jim Crow hadn't gone anywhere while they fought. In fact, in some ways, racial tensions had intensified during the war years. The Great Migration had brought thousands of black Americans north, seeking jobs in wartime industries. This created economic competition and resentment among white workers. Race riots had broken out in several cities during the war. The summer of 1919 would bring even worse violence, with massacres in Chicago, Washington, D.C., and dozens of other cities. Black veterans found themselves targets. White supremacists saw armed, confident black men as threats. There were incidents of veterans being attacked for wearing their uniforms in public, especially in the South. Henry Johnson, the hero who had fought off a German raiding party and earned France's highest honor, returned home to find himself unable to work due to his injuries. He struggled financially, turned to alcohol to cope with pain and trauma, and died in poverty in 1929. The country he'd defended so bravely had little use for him once the war ended. His story was repeated across the regiment. Many veterans found it difficult to find work. Employers discriminated openly. The benefits promised to veterans were often denied to black soldiers through bureaucratic obstacles. The GI Bill and other programs that would help World War II veterans wouldn't exist for another generation. These men had to make their own way, and the country wasn't making it easy. Colonel William Hayward, their white commander, tried to advocate for his men after the war. He wrote articles praising their service, gave speeches about their courage, but even his voice couldn't overcome the systemic racism built into American society. The Army, which had never wanted black combat soldiers in the first place, went back to its pre-war policies. Black soldiers were again relegated to service roles. The lessons of the 369th's performance were deliberately ignored. Military planners wrote reports concluding that black soldiers had only succeeded because of French leadership, ignoring the fact that black officers had led many of the regiment's most successful actions. Some military historians of the era went so far as to fabricate accounts of black troops failing in combat, creating a false narrative that would persist for decades. The men of the 369th found themselves fighting a new battle, the battle for memory, for recognition, for the truth of what they'd accomplished to be preserved. Some wrote memoirs. Others gave interviews to black newspapers, which covered their stories when white papers ignored them. They held reunions, keeping their bonds alive, supporting each other through the difficult years of peace. The veterans became active in their communities, many joining the civil rights organizations that were beginning to coalesce into what would become the civil rights movement. They had faced German machine guns and artillery. They weren't going to be intimidated by segregation and discrimination. Their service became a rallying cry. If we're good enough to die for this country, we're good enough to vote, to eat in any restaurant, to send our children to any school. But the fight was exhausting. Many veterans struggled with what we now recognize as PTSD, though in that era there was no diagnosis, no treatment, no understanding. They self-medicated, isolated themselves, or simply endured in silence. The psychological wounds of the Argonne didn't heal just because they'd come home. Some men woke screaming for years. Others couldn't bear loud noises. Family members tried to understand, but couldn't really grasp what these men had been through. The gap between the soldiers' experiences and civilian understanding was vast and painful. Still, there were bright spots. The parade had meant something. The community support in Harlem never wavered. Black churches, social organizations, and businesses honored the veterans when the broader society wouldn't. James Reese Europe, the band leader, went on to revolutionize American music, bringing jazz to audiences that had never heard it before. His influence on American culture was profound, though tragically brief. He was murdered in 1919 by a mentally disturbed band member, cutting short a brilliant career. But his legacy, and that of the 369th Band, lived on in the jazz age that followed. The veterans themselves became living bridges between the war and the civil rights struggles to come. They raised children and told them stories of what they'd done, not boasting, but bearing witness. They joined organizations like the NAACP, fought against lynching, and demanded voting rights. Their military service gave them a moral authority that was hard to dismiss. When they said they deserved equal treatment, they had bled for America to prove it. Before their story could become legend, it first had to survive being buried. The decades following World War I saw a systematic effort to erase or minimize the contributions of the Harlem Hellfighters, to reduce them to footnotes, while white units received the glory. Understanding this erasure is crucial to understanding why their story matters so much today. In the years immediately after the war, the U.S. military establishment faced a dilemma. The 369th's combat record was undeniable. French military honors were a matter of record. Newspaper accounts, especially in the black press, had documented their achievements. But acknowledging their success would undermine the military's segregationist policies and the racial theories that justified them. The solution was institutional amnesia. Official Army histories downplayed the 369th's contributions or omitted them entirely. When they were mentioned, it was often with qualifications. They had performed adequately under French command, the accounts would say, implying that they needed white European leadership to succeed. The fact that many of the regiment's officers were black was conveniently overlooked. The heroism of individuals like Henry Johnson was acknowledged briefly, then allowed to fade from public memory. Johnson, who should have received the Medal of Honor for his actions in May 1918, was passed over. The official explanation was that the paperwork hadn't been properly filed. The real reason was that the military wasn't ready to give its highest honor to a black soldier. In textbooks and popular histories of World War I, the 369th barely appeared. Students learned about Sergeant York, about the Lost Battalion, about Eddie Rickenbacker and other white heroes. The Harlem Hellfighters were absent. This wasn't accidental oversight. It was deliberate exclusion, part of a broader pattern of writing black Americans out of the national narrative. The impact was profound. Generations of Americans grew up not knowing that black soldiers had fought with distinction in World War I, not knowing that the longest-serving American combat unit had been a black regiment from Harlem. The erasure reinforced racist narratives about black military capability, making it easier to maintain segregation in the armed forces for another 3 decades. The veterans themselves tried to fight this erasure. They wrote letters to newspapers, contacted historians, gave talks when they could get audiences. But they were working against a tide of indifference and active resistance. White veterans organizations often excluded them. VFW and American Legion posts in many areas wouldn't accept black members. These men who had fought for America couldn't even join the organizations supposedly dedicated to honoring American veterans. Some started their own organizations, but they lacked the resources and political connections of the mainstream groups. Their voices were marginalized, their stories relegated to the black community, where they were honored and remembered, but unknown to wider America. The Great Depression made things worse. Everyone was struggling, and veterans' issues took a back seat to simple survival. The 369th veterans were hit particularly hard. Already facing employment discrimination, the economic collapse devastated many of them. Some ended up homeless. Others barely scraped by. When the Bonus Army marched on Washington in 1932, demanding promised benefits, black veterans marched with them, but faced additional hostility and discrimination even within that desperate group. World War II brought a new generation of black soldiers who faced many of the same challenges as their predecessors. The military was still segregated. Black units were still primarily assigned to labor duties. Commanders still doubted their combat capability. But the veterans of the 369th were still alive, still bearing witness. Some of them reached out to the new generation, sharing their experiences, offering encouragement. They told these young men, "We proved it could be done. Now you have to prove it again." And the World War II generation did, in places like Anzio and the Battle of the Bulge, adding their own chapters to the story of black military valor. After World War II, the military finally desegregated, but this didn't automatically lead to recognition of past service. The 369th story remained largely unknown outside the black community. Historians focusing on World War I continued to overlook them. Popular culture ignored them. The few mentions that appeared were often dismissive or riddled with stereotypes. It wasn't until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s that serious efforts began to recover and honor the Hellfighters' legacy. Historians, many of them black scholars working against resistance from academic institutions, began researching and writing about the 369th. They dug through military archives, interviewed surviving veterans, collected letters and photographs. The picture that emerged was undeniable. The Harlem Hellfighters had been one of the most effective American units in World War I, and their story had been deliberately suppressed. But even as this research was being done, time was running out. The last veterans were dying. Henry Johnson had died in 1929, poor and forgotten. Others followed through the decades. By the 1960s, only a handful remained, elderly men trying to keep the memory alive. One veteran, interviewed in the 1960s, spoke with bitterness about the decades of erasure. "We did everything they said we couldn't do. We fought as hard as any men who ever wore the uniform. And they tried to forget us anyway. Well, I'm still here, and I'm still telling the story." That determination, that refusal to let the truth die, kept the legacy alive through the darkest years. The black community never forgot. In Harlem, the 369th was honored and remembered. Church services commemorated them. Older residents told younger people about the Hellfighters. The story was passed down, generation to generation, even as mainstream America ignored it. In 1996, 77 years after his heroic action, Henry Johnson was finally awarded the Purple Heart. It was a small acknowledgement, long overdue. In 2001, the remaining veterans of the regiment were honored at a ceremony in New York. Only a tiny number were still alive, all well into their hundreds. They stood or sat in wheelchairs as officials finally spoke the words they should have heard decades earlier. "Thank you for your service. your courage, your sacrifice. In 2015, nearly a century after his heroic stand, Henry Johnson was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. President Obama presented it to his family, acknowledging that the delay had been a grave injustice. The official citation detailed his actions that night in May 1918, the wounds he sustained, the enemies he defeated. But even these belated honors couldn't fully repair the decades of neglect. Johnson had died in poverty, his contributions unrecognized by his country. Countless other veterans of the 369 had similar experiences, struggling through life without the recognition or support they deserved. The institutional denial of their legacy had real consequences, not just for them personally, but for American society. By erasing their contributions, America had impoverished its own history, lost valuable lessons, and perpetuated the myths that made continued racism possible. The fight to recover and honor the Hellfighters' legacy continues. Historians keep researching, finding new details, new stories. Documentaries have been made, books have been written, schools are starting to include them in curricula. But there's still work to be done. Many Americans still don't know the story. The 369th hasn't achieved the cultural prominence of other World War I units. The legacy denied for so long is still being reclaimed, piece by piece. The veterans themselves understood that their fight wasn't just about military glory. It was about justice, about truth, about forcing America to acknowledge all of its history, not just the comfortable parts. They knew that remembering the Harlem Hellfighters meant challenging the narratives that had excluded them, confronting the racism that tried to bury them. Before we can understand what the Harlem Hellfighters mean today, we need to see how their service rippled outward, touching everything from military policy to civil rights to American culture itself. Their story didn't end in the trenches or even with their return home. It echoed through the 20th century and beyond. The most immediate impact was on military policy, though it took decades to fully manifest. The 369th had proven that black soldiers could fight effectively, could maintain discipline under fire, could be trusted with combat roles. But the military establishment resisted these lessons. Through the 1920s and 30s, official policy remained unchanged. Black soldiers were fit only for labor and service roles. Behind the scenes, however, some officers were taking note. A few forward-thinking commanders studied the 369th's record and drew the obvious conclusions. When World War II came and the need for combat troops became desperate, there were voices within the military arguing for using black soldiers in combat. They pointed to World War I examples, including the 369th. It wasn't enough to change policy immediately, but it laid groundwork. The slow, grinding process of military desegregation that began in 1948 owed something to the Harlem Hellfighters, even if they weren't always credited. The men who fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam stood on foundations the 369th had helped lay. But the impact went far beyond military policy. The Harlem Hellfighters became symbols in the fight for civil rights. Civil rights leaders in the 1920s and beyond used their service as an argument for equality. How could America deny full citizenship to men who had fought and bled for the country? The question was powerful, precisely because it was so obviously hypocritical. Black activists pointed to the 369th again and again. These men proved their worth in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. What more proof did America need? The Double V campaign in World War II, victory over fascism abroad and racism at home, drew direct inspiration from World War I veterans. The men of the 369 had fought for democracy in Europe while being denied democracy at home. The younger generation would not accept that contradiction. The Harlem Renaissance, that explosion of black art, literature, and culture in the 1920s, was partly inspired by the confidence the Hellfighters' service had instilled. The veterans returned to Harlem having proven themselves on the world stage. They'd been honored in France, celebrated in New York. That validation fed into a broader cultural movement asserting black excellence, black dignity, black humanity. Writers like Langston Hughes and Claude McKay Musicians like Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong all worked in a cultural moment, partly shaped by the Hellfighters' triumph. The jazz that James Reese Europe and the 369th Band had introduced to France returned to America and exploded into a cultural revolution. Jazz became America's music, spreading from Harlem to the world. In Europe, the 369th service had broader implications. French soldiers and civilians who had fought alongside or been liberated by Black American troops developed different views on race than those prevalent in the United States. France wasn't free of racism, far from it, but the experience of World War I challenged some assumptions. Black American artists and writers found more acceptance in Paris in the 1920s than in New York, partly because the French remembered men like the Hellfighters. This created a cultural bridge, an Atlantic exchange that enriched both American and European culture. The legacy also touched individual lives in profound ways. Children and grandchildren of the Hellfighters grew up hearing stories of what their fathers and grandfathers had done. These stories shaped identity, instilled pride, and provided examples of courage under impossible odds. One grandson of a 369th veteran became a civil rights lawyer in the 1960s. He later said that his grandfather's service had taught him that you don't accept injustice, you fight it, even when the odds seem overwhelming. That lesson, replicated across dozens of families, hundreds of families, fed into the broader movement for racial justice. The Hellfighters also impacted how Black communities thought about military service. Despite the discrimination they faced, despite the erasure and neglect, Black Americans continued to serve in the military in high numbers. Part of this was economic necessity. The military often provided opportunities unavailable in civilian life. But part was also a sense of duty and a belief that service could be a path to respect and equality. The 369th had shown that Black soldiers could excel, and that example mattered. Even when the broader society tried to forget, Black communities remembered and honored military service. In education, the slow recovery of the Hellfighters' story has provided important lessons. When students today learn about the 369th, they learn about more than military history. They learn about systemic racism, about erasure and recovery of history, about courage in the face of injustice. They see that history is not just what happened, but what we remember and how we tell it. The Hellfighters' story teaches that marginalized voices can be silenced, but also that determined people can recover those voices and restore them to the historical record. The cultural impact continues to this day. The 369th has been the subject of books, documentaries, and even graphic novels. There have been calls to make a major film about them, though as of yet none has reached production. Each new telling introduces their story to new audiences, ensuring that the legacy denied for so long continues to be reclaimed. In military circles, the 369th is now studied at service academies as an example of unit cohesion, effective leadership, and overcoming adversity. The very institution that once tried to erase them now holds them up as an example, though this recognition is bittersweet given how long it took. The broader lesson of the Harlem Hellfighters is about the gap between ideals and reality. America fought World War I to make the world safe for democracy, in Woodrow Wilson's famous phrase. But Black Americans were denied democracy at home. The Hellfighters fought for freedom while being denied freedom. This hypocrisy wasn't unique to them. It's been a recurring theme in American history. But their story illuminates it with particular clarity. They did everything America asked of them and more. They fought with courage, maintained discipline, earned honors, and America still tried to deny them equal treatment. That should make us uncomfortable. It should make us question our narratives and our assumptions. The impact of the Hellfighters is also about the power of persistence. The veterans kept telling their story, even when no one wanted to listen. Families kept the memories alive. Scholars kept digging. And eventually, slowly, the truth came out. This teaches us that historical justice, while often delayed, is possible. It requires effort, dedication, and refusing to let important stories die. The Harlem Hellfighters' legacy is still unfolding. Each generation discovers them anew, finds new meanings, draws new lessons. For some, they're an example of military excellence. For others, a story of racial injustice. For still others, a testament to resilience and courage. They're all of these things, complex and multifaceted, human in their triumphs and struggles. Before we close the book on the Harlem Hellfighters, we need to ask, what does their story mean now, a century later? Why should we care about events from 1918 when we have our own challenges to face? The answer is that their story isn't really about the past. It's about recurring patterns, timeless lessons, and questions that every generation must answer for itself. First, there's the lesson about prejudice and performance. The German soldiers laughed at the thought of facing Black American troops. American commanders doubted they could fight effectively. Both were proven catastrophically wrong. The Hellfighters didn't just perform adequately. They excelled. They fought longer and harder than almost any other American unit. This pattern repeats throughout history. Marginalized groups are told they lack capability, then prove otherwise when given the chance. Women in combat roles, LGBTQ service members, immigrants in the military, all have faced similar doubts, and all have proven them baseless. The Hellfighters' story is a reminder that prejudice is a poor predictor of performance, and that capability exists in places that biased thinking refuses to see. Second, there's the lesson about institutional resistance to change. Even after the 369th proved themselves, even after their combat record was undeniable, the military clung to segregation for 3 more decades. This teaches us that evidence alone doesn't change institutions. Institutional change requires not just proof, but sustained pressure, advocacy, and people willing to fight battles in committee rooms and policy meetings, not just on battlefields. Every modern struggle for institutional reform, whether in military, corporate, or governmental settings, echoes this dynamic. The third lesson is about the power and danger of narrative. The Hellfighters' contributions were systematically downplayed and erased. This wasn't an accident of history. It was deliberate. Those who controlled the narrative understood that acknowledging Black military excellence would undermine segregation and racial hierarchies, so they chose to forget. This reminds us that history is not fixed and objective. It's a story we tell ourselves, and those who control that story wield enormous power. Today, in an age of information overload and competing narratives, the fight over who gets remembered and how remains as relevant as ever. Fourth, there's the lesson about dignity under pressure. The Hellfighters faced prejudice from their own army, skepticism from allies, and mockery from enemies. They could have responded with bitterness, could have fought half-heartedly, could have said, "If America doesn't believe in us, why should we fight for America?" Instead, they fought with discipline and courage, not for the approval of those who doubted them, but for their own self-respect and for the communities they represented. This kind of dignity, this refusal to let others' low expectations define your effort, is a powerful example. It speaks to anyone who has faced doubt or discrimination and had to decide how to respond. Fifth, the Hellfighters teach us about the complexity of patriotism. They loved a country that didn't love them back. They fought for ideals America wasn't living up to. This wasn't naivety, it was strategic. They understood that military service could be a tool for advancing civil rights, that proving their worth in the most dramatic way possible could help dismantle the arguments used against them. Their patriotism was complicated, conditional, and ultimately deeply subversive. They claimed American ideals and demanded America live up to them. This model of patriotism, critical yet committed, is more relevant than ever in a time of political polarization. Sixth, there's a lesson about allyship. Colonel Hayward and some French officers supported the Hellfighters when it wasn't popular or easy. They used their positions of privilege to advocate for men who couldn't advocate for themselves as effectively. This wasn't perfect white savior allyship. It was practical support that made a real difference. At the same time, the story shows the limits of allyship. Hayward couldn't change military policy or protect his men from discrimination once they returned home. Real change required systemic transformation, not just individual good intentions. This balance, recognizing both the value and limits of allies, is crucial for any movement for justice. Seventh, the Hellfighters demonstrate the importance of community support. The parade in Harlem, the ongoing recognition within the Black community, the way families preserved stories and memories, all of this sustained the legacy when the broader society tried to forget. This teaches us that marginalized communities often have to preserve their own histories, celebrate their own heroes, because dominant culture won't do it for them. It also shows the power of community to sustain people through hardship. The Hellfighters drew strength from knowing Harlem was behind them, watching, hoping, believing. That support mattered as much as any weapon. 8. There's a lesson about the long arc of justice. The Hellfighters weren't properly recognized for decades. Henry Johnson didn't receive the Medal of Honor until 2015, nearly a century after he earned it. This is frustrating, but it also teaches patience and persistence. Justice delayed is justice denied, yes, but sometimes denied justice can still be reclaimed if people refuse to give up. The scholars who dug through archives, the families who kept memories alive, the advocates who pushed for recognition, they all played a role in eventual vindication. This doesn't excuse the initial injustice, but it does offer hope that wrongs can be acknowledged and partially righted, even generations later. 9th, the story warns us about the cost of valor. The Hellfighters paid a terrible price for their achievements. Many died. Many more were wounded, physically and psychologically. Those who survived often struggled with trauma, discrimination, and poverty. Their heroism came at enormous personal cost. This should make us think carefully about how we ask people to prove themselves, about the burdens we place on marginalized groups to be twice as good to get half as much. The Hellfighters shouldn't have had to fight so hard to be treated as human beings. The fact that they did, and that it still wasn't enough in many ways, is an indictment of the society that forced that bargain on them. 10th, and perhaps most importantly, the Hellfighters teach us that change is possible, but not inevitable. They helped crack open doors that had been welded shut. Their service contributed to the eventual desegregation of the military and the broader civil rights movement. But this didn't happen automatically. It required continued struggle, organization, activism, and sacrifice from subsequent generations. The Hellfighters started something, but others had to carry it forward. This is how progress actually works, not through single heroic moments that solve everything, but through accumulating efforts across time, each generation building on what came before. For young people today facing their own challenges, the Hellfighters offer a complex but ultimately hopeful example. They show that it's possible to maintain dignity and purpose even in the face of systemic injustice. They demonstrate that proving yourself to skeptics can be worthwhile, even if you shouldn't have to do it. They illustrate that solidarity and community support can sustain you through the hardest times, and they remind us that your actions echo beyond your lifetime. The Hellfighters couldn't have known how their story would inspire people a century later, but it does. That's both humbling and empowering. What we do matters, even if we don't see all the results in our own time. For those working on issues of justice and equality today, the Hellfighters' story offers strategic lessons. First, representation matters. Having black soldiers prove themselves in combat made arguments for segregation harder to sustain. Visibility, presence, and performance in spaces where you're told you don't belong can change minds and open doors. Second, documentation is crucial. The black press covering the Hellfighters, veterans writing memoirs, photographs being preserved, all of this created a record that couldn't be entirely erased. In movements for change, creating and preserving evidence of what actually happened is vital. Third, multiple strategies work together. The Hellfighters fought in the military. Civil rights activists fought in the political and social spheres. Artists and writers fought in culture. None of these alone would have been sufficient, but together they created pressure for change from multiple directions. The Hellfighters also remind us to be skeptical of meritocracy myths. They were as good as they needed to be, and then some. They proved themselves beyond any reasonable standard, and it still wasn't enough for immediate equality. This teaches us that systems of oppression don't yield just because you've proven you deserve better. They're defended by people with vested interests in maintaining them. Changing unjust systems requires not just personal excellence, but collective action and political power. Finally, the Hellfighters' story is a reminder that history is full of stories we don't know yet. How many other regiments, units, individuals have been erased or forgotten? How many contributions have been written out of the record? The recovery of the Hellfighters' legacy should make us ask what else we're missing. It should make us curious about the gaps in our historical knowledge and committed to filling them. As we reach the end of this story, we need to understand that endings are always also beginnings. The Harlem Hellfighters' journey didn't conclude in 1919 or with the last veteran's death. It continues every time someone learns their story, every time someone draws strength from their example, every time someone refuses to accept the limitations others try to impose. Let's return to where we began. The laughter of German soldiers who thought facing Black American troops would be easy. The arrogance of American commanders who didn't believe Black soldiers could fight. The skepticism of bomber crews who, wait, that's the Red Tails. Let's stay with the Hellfighters. The German soldiers learned their error in the forests of France, in the trenches of the Argonne, where the men they mocked fought with a fury and discipline that shocked them. The American commanders learned slowly, over decades, as evidence piled up that their prejudices were baseless. Some never learned at all, clinging to racism until death. But institutions eventually changed, not because of moral awakening, but because maintaining segregation became unsustainable. The Hellfighters were part of making it unsustainable. Think about what they accomplished. They fought for 191 days in combat, longer than any other American unit in World War I. They never lost a trench, never had a man captured who wasn't wounded first. They earned hundreds of French military honors. They introduced jazz to Europe. They returned home to the largest parade Harlem had ever seen. But more than specific achievements, they changed what was possible. Before the Hellfighters, the idea of Black combat soldiers in a modern war was widely considered laughable. After them, it was proven fact. That shift from impossible to actual opened space for everything that followed. Every Black soldier who served in World War II, every civil rights activist who pointed to military service as proof of earned equality, every person who drew strength from their example was building on the foundation the Hellfighters laid. The individual men of the 369th were human, flawed, complex. Some struggled with trauma and addiction. Some became community leaders. Some faded into obscurity. They weren't saints or symbols. They were people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rose to meet them. Henry Johnson, the hero of May 15, 1918, died poor and largely forgotten. But his great-grandson grew up hearing stories about him, and those stories shaped a life of service and activism. The echo continues. James Reese Europe revolutionized American music before his tragic early death. His influence ran through jazz, through the Harlem Renaissance, through every American art form that followed. The echo continues. Colonel Hayward spent years advocating for his men, writing letters, giving speeches, fighting bureaucracy. He didn't change everything, but he changed some things. The echo continues. The soldiers who returned and joined the NAACP, who fought against lynching, who demanded voting rights, they carried the Hellfighters' legacy into the civil rights struggles of the 1920s and beyond. The echo continues. The families who preserved photographs and letters, who told stories to children and grandchildren, who refused to let the memory die, they kept the legacy alive through decades of institutional erasure. The echo continues. The scholars who researched, who wrote articles and books, who recovered the story from archives and fading memories, they brought the Hellfighters back into public consciousness. The echo continues, and now, a century later, people are still discovering their story, still finding inspiration, still learning lessons relevant to contemporary struggles. The echo continues. This is how history actually works. Not as a series of isolated events in the past, but as ongoing conversations between past and present. The Hellfighters speak to us across a century because their story touches fundamental questions about courage, justice, identity, and human dignity. These questions don't age. When you face doubt, when people tell you that you can't do something, that you don't belong, that success is impossible for someone like you, remember the Hellfighters. They heard all of that and worse. They were mocked by enemies, rejected by their own country, told they lacked the fundamental qualities needed for the challenge ahead. They proved every doubter wrong, not through arguing, not through complaining, but through discipline, courage, and excellence under the most extreme pressure imaginable. When you're exhausted, when the struggle feels endless, when you wonder if anything you do really matters, remember the Hellfighters. They fought for 191 consecutive days. They climbed out of trenches into machine gun fire. They held positions when everything in them wanted to run. They did this not knowing if it would lead to recognition or change, but because it was what they'd committed to doing. And their perseverance did matter, did change things, even if they didn't live to see the full impact. When you're tempted to give up on institutions or systems that seem irredeemably broken, remember the Hellfighters. They served a military that didn't want them, fought for a country that treated them as second-class citizens, and still managed to plant seeds of change that would eventually flower. They show us that you can work within broken systems while simultaneously pushing to transform them. You don't have to choose between participation and resistance. When you wonder if history will remember you fairly, remember the Hellfighters. They were forgotten deliberately, erased systematically, denied recognition for decades. But the truth survived. Families kept it alive. Communities preserved it. Scholars recovered it. And now their story is being told again. Their contributions acknowledged. Their legacy claimed by new generations. This teaches us that historical justice, while often delayed, is possible if people refuse to let truth die. When you think about what courage looks like, remember the Hellfighters. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's not reckless bravado or thoughtless aggression. The Hellfighters were afraid. They'd have been foolish not to be. But they acted anyway, disciplined in the face of terror, committed to their mission, even when it cost them dearly. That's real courage, acting with purpose despite fear, maintaining standards under pressure, staying true to your values when it would be easier to abandon them. When you think about leadership, remember Colonel Hayward and the black officers of the 369 who led under impossible conditions. Leadership isn't about having all the answers or being free from doubt. It's about making decisions under pressure, taking care of those under your command, and fighting for them even when institutions oppose you. The officers of the 369th led men who carried the weight of representing their entire race. That's leadership under pressure few can imagine. When you think about community, remember Harlem welcoming the Hellfighters home. Remember the black press covering their achievements when white papers ignored them. Remember families preserving memories and passing down stories. Community isn't just about shared space or common background. It's about mutual support, collective memory, and the willingness to honor and preserve what matters even when the broader world doesn't care. The Hellfighters story is ultimately about human potential and the artificial barriers we place on it. They were ordinary men, no different in their basic humanity from the soldiers who doubted them or the enemies they fought. What made them extraordinary was the circumstance they faced and their response to it. They were told they couldn't. They proved they could. That simple reversal, repeated across hundreds of men and dozens of battles, changed history. It didn't change it as much as it should have. Justice came too slowly. Recognition arrived too late for many who deserved it. But it did change things. And that change continues, rippling forward through time. Today, the 369th Infantry Regiment still exists as a National Guard unit, now fully integrated, carrying on the traditions of the Harlem Hellfighters. When its members put on their uniforms, they wear the legacy of men who fought when the odds were stacked against them. That legacy is a gift and a responsibility. In Harlem, there are memorials to the Hellfighters. Streets bear their name. Plaques mark their history. Children walk past these memorials every day, maybe not always knowing the full story, but absorbing through the landscape of their neighborhood that something important happened here, that people from this place did something that mattered. In France, there are graves and memorials where some of the Hellfighters remain, buried far from home and soil they helped defend. French schoolchildren sometimes leave flowers, taught by their teachers about the American soldiers, black soldiers, who came to help France in its darkest hour and never left. In museums and archives, researchers continue to uncover new details about the 369th. Letters are discovered, photographs are identified, stories that were lost are recovered. Each discovery adds texture and complexity to our understanding, reminding us that history is never fully known, always being reconstructed, always offering new insights. In homes across America and beyond, descendants of the Hellfighters carry the story forward. Some know every detail, have researched extensively, become keepers of the flame. Others know only fragments. A great-grandfather who served, a medal passed down through generations. But these connections matter. They're threads linking past to present, turning history from abstract narrative into family legacy. And in this moment, as you hear or read this story, the echo continues through you. What you do with it is up to you. Maybe you'll share it, extending its reach to someone who needs to hear it. Maybe you'll dig deeper, learning more, adding to the recovery and preservation of this history. Maybe you'll draw personal strength from it, applying its lessons to your own struggles and challenges. Or maybe you'll simply remember, carrying the knowledge that a century ago, a group of men from Harlem fought in the forests of France and proved that courage and excellence transcend the barriers prejudice tries to impose. Whatever you do with it, the story remains. The Harlem Hellfighters fought for 191 days in World War I. They fought longer than that for recognition and justice. And in a sense, they're still fighting every time their story challenges someone's assumptions, every time it inspires someone to persevere, every time it reminds us that history is written by those who show up and refuse to quit. The German soldiers stopped laughing. The American commanders eventually, grudgingly, changed their minds. The French honored them with their highest medals, and a century later, we're still telling their story, still learning from their example, still grappling with the questions they force us to confront. That's legacy. That's how ordinary men become extraordinary. Not through superhuman abilities, but through responding to their moment with courage, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to proving that the limitations others imposed on them were lies. The Harlem Hellfighters were rejected by America, but called heroes by Europe. They fought for a country that didn't fully accept them. They earned honors their own military was reluctant to give. They returned home to both celebration and discrimination. They struggled, persevered, and eventually triumphed, not completely, but significantly. Their story is messy, complicated, frustrating, and ultimately inspiring. It's not a simple tale of good versus evil, or easy victory over injustice. It's a human story, full of contradiction and complexity, which is why it still resonates. As we close, remember this: the laughter of their enemies ended in the mud of France. The doubts of their commanders were answered in blood and courage. The attempt to erase their legacy was defeated by persistent truth-telling. And the echo of what they accomplished continues, through you, through everyone who hears and shares their story, through every person who faces doubt and remembers that a century ago, some men from Harlem proved that nothing is impossible when you refuse to accept the limitations others try to impose. If you found yourself moved by this story, if the Harlem Hellfighters reminded you that courage takes many forms and that justice, though delayed, is worth fighting for, then carry that forward. Share the story. Tell others. Make sure these men are not forgotten again. They earned that much at least. They earned it in the trenches of France, in the struggle for recognition, and in the ongoing fight for equality. Their service helped advance. The Harlem Hellfighters, rejected at home, heroes abroad, fighters always. Their story doesn't end here. It echoes forward, waiting for the next person who needs to hear it. The next moment when someone needs proof that what seems impossible isn't. The next generation that needs heroes who look like them and face challenges they recognize. The echo continues. Make sure it never stops.